There is a small wooden compass sitting on a shelf above where I write this. It fits in one palm. 8 directions are carved into its face with a knife. N, N-E, S, S, S-W, W, N-W. And the cuts are clean enough that whoever made it had patience and a good edge. There is no needle inside. There never was. It points nowhere, which is the whole point of it, or so I have come to understand. I have moved it from one place to another for going on 2 years now, and I have never once considered leaving it behind. Everything that matters about the autumn of 1883 began with a rusted shape at the edge of a field. We had come down out of the Little Belt Mountains on the 7th of October, a Sunday, moving south and east through the Judith Basin on a trail that was more suggestion than road. The grass was the color of old straw. The sky over central Montana Territory in early October has a particular quality, blue the way cold water is blue, deep and slightly threatening, and it sat above us that morning without a cloud in it. My brother carried the rifle. I carried the hatchet on my belt, and the pack that had been rubbing my left shoulder since a strap broke back in August, and I'd re-sewn it with the wrong kind of cord. 40 pounds on a bad strap, 11 miles behind us already, the sun not yet high. We had been told in Lewistown, 3 days prior, that there was a trading post at a settlement called Utica, roughly 4 miles southeast of the main trail, and that a man there dealt fairly. We were low on salt and nearly out of lamp oil, and my brother had said we would stop if it did not cost us more than half a day. It was the morning of Tuesday, the 9th of October, when we first saw it. We had cut across open ground to save distance, angling toward a line of cottonwoods that marked a creek. The field was wide, and the grass came to our knees, and the light was the long, low light of mid-morning. My brother stopped walking. He did not say anything. He rarely said anything when he saw something worth looking at. He just stopped and looked at it until he decided what to do. I came up beside him and saw what he saw. A shape at the far edge of the field, where the grass thinned near a shallow drainage ditch, long and low, iron-wheeled, a dull reddish-orange that was not the color of the grass or the earth, the color a thing turns when iron has been left out in the weather for a decade or more. Large enough to have been a vehicle once, now sunk at one corner, listing slightly east, with the tall autumn grass growing up through the wheel spokes. My brother looked at it for a long moment. Then he started walking toward it. We crossed the field slowly, the way you approach something that might still be alive. The grass was heavy with dew that late in the morning, and by the time we had covered half the distance, my boots were soaked through. My brother walked a few paces ahead of me, not fast, not slow. The same pace he used on game trails when he was paying close attention. His rifle was still slung across his back. That told me something. He didn't think we were in danger. He just wasn't sure yet what we were walking toward. The shape resolved itself the closer we got. An overland wagon. No, larger than that. A stage body of some kind, mounted on an iron-wheeled frame, 18 feet maybe. The paint had once been dark red, the color of dried blood or old brick, and you could still see it in the sheltered places, under the roofline and in the shadow beneath the frame, where the weather had not reached as deeply. Everywhere else the iron had gone to rust and the wood had gone to gray, and the whole thing sat in the grass like something the earth was in the slow process of swallowing. My brother circled it once without a word, then again, in the opposite direction, slower. I stood back and looked at it straight on. The front axle had cracked and settled, dropping the left corner down into the drainage ditch by a hand's width. That was probably the end of it as a working vehicle. You couldn't repair a cracked axle out here with nothing but field grass and good intentions. Someone had known that. The wheels had sunk into the soft ground at the ditch edge, and the grass had grown up through the spokes so thickly that it looked almost deliberate, like the kind of thing a gardener might arrange. The door was on the north side. It hung inward on one hinge, the lower hinge. The upper had pulled free from the frame, and someone had wrapped a length of leather cord around the doorpost and the handle to keep it from swinging. The cord was dark with age and had been retied at least once. You could see where an older knot had frayed and a newer one begun. I noticed a line of flat stones along the base of the south wall, not scattered the way stones end up on their own, placed, one beside the next, close enough that they formed a low border, and above them, at roughly a man's sitting height, someone had cut a small square into the wood of the wall and fitted a piece of oiled hide over it. A window, 4 inches by 6. The hide was dry and tight across the frame, and it had not rotted. My brother completed his second circle and came to stand beside me. He was looking at the leather cord on the door. Someone had tied that knot from the inside. My brother worked the leather cord loose without cutting it. He untied it carefully, holding the slack with 2 fingers while the knot came apart, and he set it on the stone border along the wall, rather than dropping it in the grass. I noticed that. He treated it like something that had been placed deliberately, which it had. The door swung inward about 4 inches and stopped. Something on the floor was in the way. A small resistance, not a lock. He pressed steadily, and whatever it was, scraped back across the boards, and the door opened far enough for a man to step through sideways. The smell came first. Not decay, not anymore. 9 months had dried whatever there was to dry. It was old wool, old iron, old tallow, the smell of a space where someone had lived for a long time, and the living had pressed itself into every surface. A closed smell, a kept smell. I went in after him. It was dim, but not dark. The oiled hide window on the south wall let in a flat gray square of light, and where that didn't reach the eye, still adjusted quickly enough. The interior was maybe 7 feet wide, the full 18 feet of the wagon's length, but the rear half was partitioned by a rough board wall someone had fitted across the width, and we were in the forward section, maybe 9 feet of it. The bunk ran along the left wall, rope and board, low to the floor, with a folded shape on it that had been 2 blankets once, and was now closer to a single matted mass, dark with age. Beside the bunk, a small iron brazier, the kind meant for a tent or a close space, sitting on 3 legs, with a chimney pipe fitted up through a hole, cut in the roof, and sealed around with hammered tin. The seal had held. A crate stood on end as a table, and on the crate, a stub of tallow candle in a tin ring. Under the bunk, the floor, and 1 board not flush with the rest, shorter than the others, with a gap at one end wide enough for 2 fingers. My brother saw it and looked at me. I crouched and got my fingers in the gap and lifted. The canvas bag was there, hand-sewn, pale gray with age, closed with a drawstring. I set it on the crate and worked the string open, and inside were 7 small journals, paper-bound, stacked and wrapped in the same canvas, each one filled margin to margin in a hand that was cramped, but not careless. I lifted the top one and opened it. I read the first line aloud. October the 4th, 1878. Wind from the north. The field is quiet, and I have decided to stay. My brother said, "Put it back." I turned the page. My brother went outside. I heard him moving through the grass, the sound of the hatchet finding dry wood, the small industry of a man who keeps his hands busy when his mind is working. I sat on the edge of the bunk with the journal open across my knees and the light coming through the cracked window glass at a low October angle, yellow and already thinning. The first journal ran from October of 1878 through the following February. Most of it was the kind of writing a man does not expect anyone else to read, short, functional, the record a careful person keeps to hold time still. November the 2nd. Hard frost overnight. Grass finished. Found late mushrooms along the creek draw, 1/2 pound maybe. Brazier drawing well. That kind of writing. Dates and temperatures and the small mathematics of survival. How many days the dried meat lasted. Where he found water when the near creek froze. What the wind sounded like against the iron side panels compared to the wooden ends. Different tones, he noted. Like a two-note instrument. He had been paying attention to the place, the way you pay attention to something you have decided matters. Then, maybe 30 pages in, the hand changed. Not the penmanship, that stayed cramped and even, but the pressure behind it. The sentences got longer. The margins got used. He had written it in November of 1878, 6 weeks after he arrived. He described coming across the bus the first time, following the wagon track southeast from Utica until the track gave out, and the field opened wide and flat, and he saw it sitting there in the tall grass, like something left by a receding tide. Rust along the iron wheel rims. One window cracked, the door hanging on a single hinge, swinging loose in the wind. He had walked around it twice. He had looked inside. He had walked away south for nearly a mile, he wrote, and then stopped and stood in the grass for a long time, with no particular reason to go back, and no particular reason to keep walking, and then turned around. I am not a man who mistakes a feeling for a sign, he wrote. But there are moments when a place asks a question, and you either answer it, or you spend the rest of your time wondering what you were afraid of. I went back. I rehung the door with a length of wire. I swept the floor with a branch. I decided that this was enough, and that enough was sufficient. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the fire had caught. I could smell the pine smoke drifting through the broken window seal. My brother was out there, in the cooling afternoon, tending something small and necessary, the way he always did. I looked at the page again, decided that this was enough, and that enough was sufficient. I had not yet figured out what it meant, but it sat on me, the way a hand sits on a shoulder, steady, without weight, meaning only, I am here. I turned the page. The next morning came in slow and gray, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's still deciding whether to be day or not. We'd slept well, better than we had any right to, given the bunk was narrow and the floor hard, and the old iron brazier threw heat in one direction only. But I woke before my brother, which was unusual, and lay listening to the grass move against the iron sides of the bus, a sound like a long, slow exhale. We did not talk much that day. There was no particular reason for it. We simply found ourselves moving through the work quietly, each taking a task and finishing it before reaching for another. My brother reset the iron bracket that held the door frame on the left side, working the rust loose with the edge of his clasp knife and pressing the metal back into shape with a flat stone and patient hands. I re-knotted the rope across the bunk where 2 loops had frayed through, working the waxed cord into the gap until it held. Small things. The kind of things a man does when he intends to stay a little longer, without yet saying so aloud. Around mid-morning, I walked the field. Not for any reason, just to see it. The grass ran long and yellow-brown in every direction, and the hills sat low and blue on the horizon, and the sky above had that enormous autumn emptiness that makes a man feel both very small and very clear. 30 yards east of the bus, I found the cairn. It was not much, a rough stack of field stones, knee-high, the kind of thing a man builds in an afternoon without ceremony. Some of the stones had shifted over the years, and 1 or 2 lay in the grass beside the pile. I called to my brother without shouting, just loud enough, and he came across the field with his hands still dirty from the bracket work. We pulled the stones apart carefully. Underneath, a rusted tin, its lid swollen and sealed with old damp. My brother pried it open with his knife. Inside the tin there was no food. Whatever had been stored there was gone, consumed or long rotted. There was only a slip of paper, folded twice, the paper itself, gone the color of old cream. My brother unfolded it and read it once to himself. Then he read it aloud, quietly, the way a man reads something he wants to be sure he's heard correctly. Left enough, took nothing. That was all, 4 words and 3. We stood there in the grass, beside the disassembled cairn, and neither of us spoke. The wind moved through. A hawk crossed the sky to the south, riding something invisible. My brother folded the paper along its original creases and held it in his hand without putting it down, and I looked at the rusted tin, and neither of us said anything for a long time. The fifth day we walked to town, 4 miles southeast through the last of the morning fog, down off the bench and into the flat where the grass grew shorter and the wagon ruts started. My brother carried the hide rolled and tied under his arm, a mule deer he'd taken 10 days back on the trail south of the Judith River, cured since then in salt and smoke, until it was stiff enough to trade. We'd been out of lamp oil for 2 days. The hardtack was holding, but we wanted salt. The settlement was not much. A dozen buildings, some of them still raw lumber, one with a sod roof already going to seed, a water trough with a crack down one side. The trading post sat at the far end, a low structure with a porch that had warped at one corner so that it tilted slightly toward the street, like a man listening for something underground. The man behind the counter was broad across the shoulders, with a gray beard kept short, and eyes that had seen enough seasons in this country to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He took the hide, turned it, ran his thumb along the edge of the cure, and offered 2 pints of lamp oil and a half-pound of salt without being asked. My brother accepted. I described the bus while the man measured the salt. An overland stage, I said. Oxblood red once, or something close to it. Out in the grass east of town, maybe 4 miles, sitting alone in the field with the axle settled into the ground. The man set down his measure and looked at me. He said he knew it, said there'd been an old army man living out there for, he paused and thought, 5 years, maybe a little more. Farrier, he believed, came through one spring with almost nothing, looked the bus over, and just stayed. Came into town maybe 3 or 4 times a year, for salt or oil or wire. Never said much. Paid in small coin or in work. He'd reshod 2 horses for the man across the road, once, in exchange for a sack of dried corn. Then the man said, people figured he'd died out there last winter. Cold came in hard in January. Nobody had gone to look. He said it the way you say a thing that is simply true, without apology, without particular shame, but with a flatness that meant he'd already settled it inside himself. People had figured. Nobody had gone. Those were 2 separate facts, and they sat beside each other without touching. I thanked him and carried the oil outside. My brother was already on the porch. He looked at my face and didn't ask. We walked back the way we'd come, through the ruts and the short grass, back toward the bench. The man had known he was out there. The whole small town had known, and the snow had come, and nobody had walked 4 miles. We walked back without talking. That was usual for us after a thing like that. Not the silence of men who have nothing to say, but the silence of men letting something settle before they put words to it. The oil sloshed in the tin against my hip. The grass was pale in the late afternoon, and the bench sat dark against the sky ahead of us, and the bus was just a shape beneath it, the color of old blood gone to rust. My brother set about the fire outside, and I climbed in through the door with the lamp oil. I trimmed the wick on the small tin lamp we'd found hung from a wire nail, and filled it and lit it with a sulfur match. The light came up amber and low. I sat on the wooden crate and pulled the canvas bag toward me and took out the middle journals, the ones from 1879 through 1881, the years when the man had been here long enough to stop explaining himself to himself and start simply recording what the days held. I read for a long time. He wrote about weather the way a farmer writes about weather, not with feeling, but with the precision of a man whose life turns on small differences in temperature and wind. He wrote about which grasses came up first in the creek bottom, and what that told him about the coming weeks. He wrote about a badger that lived in a den 40 yards to the east, and the small drama of its comings and goings. These entries were short. The others were longer. He had a wife. Her name was Clara. He had a son, Thomas, who would have been somewhere around 14 by the time he was writing. They were in Chillicothe, Ohio. He did not write about them with the quality of a man who has lost something and cannot stop touching the place where it was. He wrote about them the way you write a balance in a ledger, steady, clear-eyed, without erasure. He listed the things he owed them and the things he could not have given them even if he'd stayed, and he did not dress either side up into something more than it was. He had not fled them. That was what I kept coming back to, sitting there in that amber light with the pen scratch and the careful words. He had not been run off, had not been cast out, had not been broken into pieces by some catastrophe that left him no choice. He had simply kept moving west until one day he had stopped, and the stopping had been here, and here had been enough. The distinction felt important in a way I couldn't yet name. My brother called in from outside that the fire was going and there was meat ready. I set the journal down across my knee and looked at the wall where the name was carved and thought about a man who chose the end of the road and how that choosing was a kind of answer to something. The tin box was underneath the bunk. I almost missed it. I had my hand along the floor planking, checking the boards for rot, the way my brother had shown me to do in any structure we meant to sleep in, pressing with the heel of my palm, listening for the give, and my fingers found the edge of it pushed back against the wall where the light from outside didn't reach. It was small, maybe 6 inches by 4, with a fitted lid gone greenish at the seams from damp, not locked. The lid came off with a little pressure and a sound like a breath released. Inside, wrapped in a fold of oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a tintype photograph. I held it to the light from the doorway. A woman, standing, a boy beside her, shoulder height to her, maybe 8 years old. The boy was not quite looking at the camera. His eyes were tilted slightly left, as though something had moved at the edge of the frame a half-second before the plate was made. The woman was looking straight at the lens. Her expression was the kind that sits between tenderness and something harder, something that knows the photograph is going somewhere and is deciding how to be remembered. I turned it over. The pencil marks were faint but clear. Clara and Tom, Chillicothe, Ohio, April 1868. 15 years before we were standing in that field, 15 years before I pulled this out from under a dead man's bunk, I thought of the journals, all that careful accounting of what was owed and what couldn't be repaid, and I thought of this woman who had stood in front of a camera in Ohio in the spring of 1868 and decided how to look, and I felt something tighten in my chest that wasn't grief exactly, and wasn't pity exactly, and didn't have a name I knew. I took the box outside. My brother was crouched by the fire, turning the meat. He looked up when I came around the corner. I held the tin out without saying anything and watched him take it, lift the oilcloth, and look at the tintype. He looked at it for a long time. The fire settled and sent a tongue of orange light across his face. I watched his jaw set. That particular set it got, that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with the effort of not speaking. He turned the photograph over. Read the back, turned it to the front again, and looked at the boy with the wandering eyes. Then he laid the tintype back in the tin, replaced the oilcloth, and set the lid on with both thumbs pressing it flat. He set the box beside him on the ground with a care that was almost formal, as if it were breakable, as if it had always been breakable. He didn't say anything. I sat down across the fire from him and didn't say anything either. We ate without talking. The meat was good, better than I expected, and the fire did what fires do, which is make the silence between two people feel less like a wound and more like an agreement. When we finished, he banked the coals, and I went inside and lay down on my bedroll on the floor. I could hear the wind picking up in the grass outside. Somewhere north of us, a branch broke. I did not sleep well. The cold came on in stages, the way it does in October, each hour a little further than the last, and by midnight, it had found every gap in the iron frame and every split in the old planking, and was working through them steadily and without apology. I pulled the one good blanket over my coat and lay listening to the structure talk. The small pops and contractions of cooling metal, the creak of the sidewall in the wind. The brazier had nothing left in it. At some point, I noticed my breath was visible in the dark. I was already awake when gray came. I sat up and saw what the night had left. The rim of the brazier wore a thin crust of ice. The window gap had a skin of frost along its lower edge, white and exact as a line drawn with chalk. Outside, the grass had gone silver. Every blade stood rigid, and the field was perfectly still in that particular way of a hard frost, as if the cold had pressed the whole world flat and held it there. He was already up. I found him outside, standing with his back to the bus, looking out at the field. His breath moved in slow plumes. He had his coat buttoned to the collar and his hat pulled low, and he was looking at the frost, the way a man looks at something that has just made a decision for him. I came and stood beside him, didn't speak. After a minute, he turned and looked at the bus, at the split in the roof seam, at the gap where the door hung wrong on its upper hinge, at the places where wind got in. He said, "We're staying. We're going to fix it properly." That was all, not a question, not a negotiation. He said it the way a man states what is already true, and then he walked around to look at the roof. I stood a moment longer in the silver field. I understood it wasn't only the frost that had decided him. It was the tin box sitting on the ground by the dead fire. It was the boy with the wandering eyes. It was 5 years of a man living in something nobody bothered to come back for. We were going to come back for it. We worked. That is the plainest way I can put it. The 4 days after the frost were the longest and the most purposeful we had spent in months. And there is a particular quality to work that has a reason behind it. It moves differently through the body than work done only from necessity. This had reason behind it. The roof was the first problem. The seam along the crown had split where the iron channel had rusted through, and every night the cold came down through it like water through cupped hands. We spent the better part of the first day cutting birch bark in long strips from a stand 300 yards east, carrying it back in armloads, laying it in overlapping courses beneath a run of waxed linen cord, laced tight through small holes we punched with the awl from the farrier's roll. It wasn't pretty, it was tight, and it would hold through October, which was all we needed it to do. The door took most of the second morning. The upper hinge had pulled away from the frame. The wood behind it had gone soft with water, and we had to cut a fresh block from a piece of green split ash, fit it flush, and strap the hinge back down with lengths of iron wire heated in the fire until they could be bent and twisted into place. The older brother worked the wire without gloves. I watched his hands and did not say anything about them. The third day we stacked stone. There was a low outcropping 40 yards to the north, and we carried the flat pieces by hand, building a windbreak along that side of the bus. Knee-high at first, then waist-high by afternoon, tight enough that you had to turn sideways to pass through the gap we left for the door. It cut the wind noticeably. Standing inside after we finished, I could hear it moving past outside without feeling it. That evening, I sat on the edge of the bunk and read the last entries in the final journal. January 1883. He had known, not in words, not with any declaration. The entries were as matter-of-fact as they had ever been. The cold this week, a note about the brazier drawing poorly, a calculation of how many days the remaining hardtack might last if halved. And then, on what I judged to be the 3rd or 4th day of the month, the date was smudged, or he had stopped writing the date. A sentence about frost, about the way it built on the interior walls in the mornings, the patterns it made, the particular blue light it gave to everything before the sun came up. The sentence stopped in the middle. I closed the journal. I held it in both hands and sat with the weight of it for a long while, and outside the wind moved around the stone wall we had built, and the fire in the brazier threw small light across the floor. The morning of the 20th came in gray and still. The frost had not lifted from the grass yet. I could see it when I pushed the door open. The field white and stiff all the way to the tree line. The sky the color of old tin. We had packed most of what we came with the night before. The pack stood propped against the interior wall, buckled and ready. The bunk had been stripped of the serviceable blanket and left flat. The wooden crate sat in its place. The brazier had gone cold sometime before dawn. I was doing a last walk of the interior, the habit of a man who has left too many campsites and has learned to check twice, when I saw it. Tucked under the near leg of the brazier, half in shadow, small enough that I had walked past it a dozen times without registering the shape. I crouched and picked it up. The wooden compass, carved from a single knot of pine, smoothed by handling until the surface had the quality of worn soap. 8 directions cut into its face, with something fine-pointed. A nail, maybe, or the tip of a farrier's pick. No needle, no glass, nothing inside but the wood itself, and the words carved around the rim, in letters so small I had to bring it close to the light from the doorway to read them. I had read the entry where he described making it. It was in the 5th journal, sometime in the spring of 1880. A man can lose his heading without ever moving a foot, he had written. I carved this to remind myself that knowing where you are matters more than any needle. The needle tells you north. This tells you to look. I stood there in the doorway for what felt like a full minute. Then I put it in my coat pocket. The other one was watching from outside. He didn't ask. I didn't explain. We both understood certain things without language, the way you do when you have spent enough years in close country with one person. What we did next took perhaps 20 minutes. We took turns with the clasp knife. He went first, I followed. The interior wall beside Elias's name. Not ownership, nothing like that. Only what it was. The names of 2 men who had also stayed, who had also made use of what the old man had built and left standing. 3 names on that wall. That felt right. That felt like the correct number. Then I retrieved the journals from beneath the floorboard, wrapped tightly in their oilcloth. I held them once more, just held them, before I set them back and pressed the board flat with my boot. We walked out across the field in the 3rd week of October, the grass flattened by the first hard frosts and pale as straw underfoot. The sky was that particular shade of autumn blue that has no warmth in it at all, bright and cold and final. Our packs rode the same as always, 40 pounds apiece, the same rifle, the same hatchet, the same roll of cord. Nothing heavier than when we'd arrived. The compass was in my coat pocket, small enough that I could close my fingers around it entirely, which I did, more than once, that first morning out. I have thought about him many times since, about what it takes to choose a cracked axle wagon in a Montana field and decide, quietly, without ceremony, that this is the place. No deed, no neighbors, no one to tell, just the decision itself, made and kept for 5 years running, through 5 winters, through whatever loneliness that field held in February, when the wind came down off the Judiths, and the temperature dropped past the point where a man stops counting. He had Clara's face in a tin box, and a brazier that barely warmed 10 square feet, and his own hands for company. He had his journals, which he filled with the weather and the birds and the long thoughts of a man who has stopped explaining himself to anyone. What he built was not much, by any measure a stranger might apply. But he built it, and he kept it, and when he was done with it, he left it standing. That is more than most. I don't know what my brother made of those 11 days. We have not spoken of it directly, even now. That is also the way of it. Between brothers who have traveled long enough together, some things get understood so thoroughly that saying them aloud would only diminish them. What I know is that he carved his name on that wall without hesitating, and he was the one who checked the floorboard twice before we left. pressing it flat with his boot, the way you check a knot before you trust your weight to it. There is something the high country teaches you, if you stay long enough and pay attention. It is not a lesson about survival, though people expect that. It is simpler than that. It is only this: a man with one person he trusts, and a place he has decided to care for, is not poor. He is, in the only way that lasts, exactly where he needs to be. If any of that is familiar to you, the wandering, the one person, the place that chose you before you chose it, leave us a word below. And if you've stayed this long, stay a little longer. We're glad of the company.